The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you.
O Lord. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before the people, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test Jesus, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When the scribes and Pharisees kept on questioning him, Jesus straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again, Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground. When the scribes and Pharisees heard what Jesus said, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Now, the story of the woman caught in adultery, it's an awfully curious tale. Even as the story's central figure is this adulteress, the point of it doesn't concern her. The story is not about her at all, but about those who bring her to Jesus. And by extension, it's about those who respond to the problem of sin in our world, not by seeking to actually address it effectively, but who use it for their own advantage, to gain power over others. And if an economy of sin is the source of your power, then in his message of mercy and forgiveness, in his offer of grace and healing so as to escape and recover from sin, Jesus is a threat. We as Christians have to be about forgiveness and healing. And that's not to say that sin is something that we can ignore or tell people don't worry about that because, we don't want them to feel bad. Trust me, they feel bad already. They may lead a life of distraction, even degeneracy, doubling down on their sins in a perverse kind of spiritual self-medicating to escape the suffering, but they only compound it. Sin is still the problem. Jesus is consistent throughout his teaching about the danger of sin, the reality of hell. Sin kills the spirit and consigns the soul to damnation. But his message is more so, grace heals the wound of sin in the sinner. And if the sinner, like a good patient, listening to his physician, taking the medicine, following the treatment, he accepts this free gift from God, then he will be healed. Were the story really about the woman caught in adultery, it would have unfolded very differently. For one, the conversation that we get to listen in on, it's not between her and Jesus. As we might find in the famous story of the Samaritan woman at the well, we knew that woman was a sinner. And that story is about her encounter with Jesus. In today's gospel, we can only imagine the adulteress standing there in front of the crowd, saying nothing, while Jesus is pestered by the scribes and the Pharisees, and he famously writes with his finger in the dust. She is never heard to ask for mercy, for forgiveness. When this whole episode is over, Jesus simply dismisses her and tells her, "Sin no more." The story isn't really about Jesus. We can compare this story to the one, the famous one about the paralyzed man who they have to open up the roof in the house where Jesus is staying and lower him down. Remember that one? He tells the man his sins are forgiven, and the scribes and the Pharisees who witnessed that all have the same thought at the same time. Well, who does he think he is to forgive sins? That story was about establishing Jesus' authority. That's not in dispute here. Rather, this episode from the Gospels is about human hypocrisy and the recurring fashion among us to present, ourselves as servants of society here to eradicate evil, when really we're being self-serving and using a very real problem to have power over others rather than to actually solve the problem. And here in this gospel passage, we see people who've clearly been threatened by Jesus' message of mercy and forgiveness, and so they've engineered this whole scenario. We know they are testing him. They want to discredit him. Now, the text says that this woman, she is an adulterer, so we know that charge is true. And it is said that she was caught in the very act of adultery. However, that they caught her in the very act, I don't know, that strikes me as a little suspicious. Were these Pharisees on the lookout for just such a person as she, looking to catch her, not for the sake of eradicating sin, not for the sake of the spiritual health of the community, but really it's all about finding a way to trap Jesus? And so in this sense, they are victimizing her. And yes, a sinner can be victimized. Being a sinner doesn't mean you don't deserve to be treated justly. God will treat you justly, according to justice. That's why we should all be concerned about sin. We're going to get what we deserve. This case is presented to Jesus as open and shut. We don't need to investigate the charge. She is guilty. So she's brought to Jesus for him to pronounce that awful sentence. This smacks of another famous attempt to trap him. You remember the time the Jews asked him if they should be paying taxes to the Romans? And he asks for a coin, shows them that the emperor's face is there on it, and then he says famously, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's." His interlocutors are just playing politics, and he won't play along. The not-so-subtle accusation Jesus makes towards those who appear to be advocating stoning to death the woman is that they aren't serious about dealing with sin. Again, they're just playing politics. They're looking to trap him, not help resolve a serious problem that plagues individuals and society. And he knows they're sinners. Let the one without sin be the first to cast a stone. In ancient societies, sin was perceived as a very serious problem. In fact, the word that we often hear today about pollution, we think of an environmental sense, of it affecting the physical world around us. In the ancient world, if you spoke of pollution, you were talking about spiritual corruption. It was that big a problem. And I'd say, we still, to a certain extent, do understand sin as a problem in today's society. But the thing is, it's a matter of what you consider to be a sin. Now, in the ancient world, sexual sins were seen as being very corrosive of the social fabric. Adultery is the only sin that's referenced in the Ten Commandments. The one about not coveting your neighbor's wife. And think about it, the most famous story outside the Bible is Homer's Iliad, the epic tale of the Trojan War that was fought because a Trojan prince, Paris, stole another man's wife. So putting to Jesus a case involving adultery is to raise emotions, bring out strong opinions among the onlookers. And even today, most have very negative opinions about people who fool around on their spouses. However, to be frank, given the kind of celebrity gossip culture we have, adultery in the secular world is now what you might, as a Catholic, consider in the venial order, not seen as the worst thing. Yet there are great sins within the modern ideology that we see at work today. They're not biblical sins. They're not from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the thought crimes of today are being treated like sins against, very similar to the way we treated those sins against the biblical moral code of bygone days. Now, the modern sins are many and changing. We see them condemned in our media all the time. For example, in the minds of some, it is a sin to, use incorrect pronouns for those who've invested their identity in such things. We've seen how in some quarters it's a sin to question certain experts or raise concerns about public questions that touch on, say, the environment or foreign policy and so on. And that once a matter is considered settled by our cultural and political leadership, it can never be reopened for discussion, even if evidence comes to light that would make it prudent and responsible to do so. In our formerly liberal and open society, we're now seeing closed-mindedness raised up as a virtue, provided, of course, that mind has been shut once the subject has been properly indoctrinated. I meet, it almost seems like a constant stream through week after week of people who speak to me about how they find themselves walking on eggshells as they come to see that almost every day they are being tested by others to see if they hold acceptable opinions, and how they fear that an honest answer will see them ostracized, even fired from their jobs. And the other great fear is to be put through the humiliation of being forced to make a public apology. Of course, these forced apologies are at heart insincere, compelled as they are by the threat of social cancellation, job loss, and so on. But even when offered with as much authenticity as one can muster, no one today is ever really forgiven. The humiliation persists in being forever under suspicion. And all of this is being done in the name of social justice, equity, tolerance, diversity, yet the results are objectively unjust, iniquitous, divisive, and an imposition of stultifying uniformity. Seeing this, one must ask what the champions of this new regime are really about. As Jesus has said elsewhere of the scribes and Pharisees, they load burdens onto the people, but they do nothing to really help them. People sin, but atop the weight of these offenses against God and neighbor, they added the burden of the fear of condemnation, of social isolation, and as we see in today's gospel passage, death. Now, Jesus never dismisses sin as a problem. He constantly speaks of its dangers, how it opens the gates of hell to us, how we need to repent and turn to our loving Father in heaven for forgiveness. We certainly know there are problems in our society today. The legacy of humanity's history of sin. The remedy is not to be found in the murder of people's reputations, the canceling of their social lives, the depriving them of their livings. It's understood in the Catholic faith that sin is more than a legal infraction. It's more than simply breaking a rule. In spiritual terms, it is analogous to a toxin. It can be likened to a disease. Indeed, it can be a contagious one. And that does come from ancient wisdom. The leper and the sinner were one and the same in a sense. But where ancient peoples had no good remedy, we have the cure. And where leprosy was not understood and its victims condemned to perpetual quarantine, where the sinner was encouraged more to conceal his sin in misery than seek remedy, today we know there are medicines to treat the leprous, and there is medicinal grace to salve and heal the ailing soul. Authoritarian and totalitarian regimes deal with such things with cruel, singular solutions, sometimes as crude as rounding up the infected and killing them as a way to stop the spread. I've mentioned in past homilies the gulag of the former Soviet Union, meant to deal with the crime of thinking contrary to the regime's project of bringing paradise to the earth. They worked people to death there. You know, when I was at seminary and being instructed in the art of the confessor, we were taught that indeed sin is a universal problem, but we were to be like any good physician. The cure is individual. And sin is not the source of my power as a priest in the confessional. It's not for me to lord it over the penitent. Rather, it is for both of us to turn to the divine physician and listen to his prescription for what ails us both as individual persons and as members of the human race. To listen to him unceasingly, so that even as we might continue to be afflicted by sin, no more will it have power over us. No more will it give power to others over us. For we, even as we might fall short of the glory of God, we will still always belong to him.